Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and I'm delighted to be joined by Deborah Evans, who is, of course, our CEO. Welcome, Deborah.
Well, hello, everybody, and I have to say it's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Now, regular listeners to the podcast will know that Dennis and I often discuss updates from the Post Office inquiry, and last week revealed more alarming facts, notably that former Post Office Chief Executive Paula Venables failed to tell MPs about 16 investigated cases where the Horizon computer software had made errors more than a decade ago. As far back as 2006, a sub-post mistress from Northern Ireland defended prosecution proceedings and was acquitted after successfully claiming the software caused a shortfall. Paula Venables was told, quote, again and again by retired Judge Sir Anthony Hooper that the organisation's case didn't make sense. Sir Hooper was speaking at the time in his capacity as chairman of a post office working group, reviewing cases of sub-postmasters who believed they'd been wrongly blamed for shortfalls. But the chief executive and lack of leadership aside, Dennis and I continue to cover the role that numerous legally qualified lawyers and barristers played in the prosecutions and handling in particular of disclosure, and in particular the role of the in-house solicitor. Now, the SRA are currently consulting on guidance for the in-house sector, raising awareness of the obligations to uphold the rule of law. You've had discussions with the SRA, Deborah. What do you consider the challenges are for the in-house lawyer?
Well, the challenges are great, and I think it's important to start with recognising the difference between compliance, which is can you do it or can't you do it, which is normally legal compliance, regulatory compliance, policy compliance, and ethics. And ethics is very much about should you do it and are you doing it correctly? And it's about truth, not convenience. It's about truth, not winning your case, which was the situation in the post office scenario. And sometimes in-house lawyers, whether they're in a local authority or in a firm or a business organisation, will have to wrestle with what is right. The very difficult thing about ethics is that it's not unambiguous. People will have different views on different sides, and actually being in-house can sometimes be a very lonely job. There's only one monitoring officer in local government, for example. So who do you test your ideas on? Who do you talk to, and how do you work out what is the right thing to do? You've also got to recognise the conflict that your organisation may be telling you that they want to do something that you don't want them to do, and they may telling you to do it. So if they're telling you to do something that you fundamentally disagree with, how do you handle that conflict? How do you remain independent and do what's best for the business, the organisation, the local authority, rather than what's best for those who are making the decision? So the aim of the Solicitors Regulation Authority was very much to provide a code from the regulator to be used as a tool. It was to give in-house lawyers the tool to be able to stand up and argue for what they believe to be right. And I think it's important to remember that if that in-house lawyer, that monitoring officer, believes something to be right or believes that the decision that is about to be made is incorrect, they will be thinking that from the perspective of the short, medium and long-term viability of that organisation. They won't be seeing it from the perspective of the individual decision maker, and that's why they're there. The power, the value that they bring is all about that integrity of serving the organisation rather than the leaders of the organisation, and having a view that may be longer than a political term or a fixed term appointment to a board or whatever it may be. And that's where the value comes. So even though it may feel really hard to stand up against what is being proposed, that's the value. That's why it's essential that that happens. So the SRA are looking at themes around independence, around management of conflicts. They're looking at things like confidentiality, but this is all about practically what can you do in these sort of situations. And I think anybody looking back at the detail of the post office inquiry will often wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, how did they get there? But you may feel the same thing if you look at something like the Sheffield Trees inquiry, where again that the community was hugely upset by the actions of the local council, to the extent at which, when we did our governance conference there, we had protesters on the doorstep with respect to the Sheffield Trees inquiry. So ethics is massively important, and I would encourage everybody to have a think about how ethics impacts on their day-to-day decision making, to have a look at this consultation and to ponder on it, and then to give some meaningful responses. We're also very aware within LLG that ethics is something you don't just know, you need to be trained to understand it and how to manage those sort of situations. So we're very much trying to build ethics into leadership training, but also as we develop training for trainees and junior lawyers in due course, we're looking at trying to distill the practical management of ethics literally from the off. Obviously, colleges, university cover ethics as an academic topic, but this is about how you deal with it in practice. So absolutely crucial, I would say.
Absolutely. Where do you see the difference, do you think, between the in-house private sector and the in-house local government sector, or should we even be worried about differences? I mean, obviously, our MOs, I suppose, have some form of statutory backing, although it's arguable how far that goes because of lack of sanctions. But where do you see the differences there between those two?
I would agree that there obviously are differences, and that the biggest one from my perspective is that in a local authority you're working in a political environment that comes with it political ambition. So the sort of challenges that you might be dealing with in-house are all around whether that ambition can actually be satisfied within the available budget of the local authority. Everybody can have big dreams, but actually, are they deliverable? Have you got the resources and the funding to deliver what the leadership may be looking for? So that's an obvious point of potential conflict. But also, you have a large council when you're working in local authorities. So the opportunity for those conflicts of interest on the planning committee or wherever they may be is much, much greater than when you're in an in-house scenario. But in-house can be a much lonelier place because on the plus side, local government legal services teams tend to be of a certain size. I do appreciate that in smaller councils, they may be quite small, but generally there tends to be a certain size and weight to them. Whereas in-house, you may be the only lawyer there. So it gets far harder and there's much more pressure on your shoulders. So that there is quite a bit of difference between in-house private and in-house local government, but there's a lot of similarity. So things around, for example, you mentioned there that there's some protections potentially for monitoring officers. There are some, but the reality is at the moment, typically, if there is a disagreement between the leadership and the monitoring officer, it can be very much career defining. I'm not using the words career limiting because actually I always think standing up for what right is an asset on your CV rather than the other way around. And that obviously is shared by an in-house lawyer standing up to the leadership. Suddenly you're no longer part of the club. So we've been campaigning for some time for proper statutory protection for monitoring officers, because it's this sort of threat on your income and you know, in effect your life and all the ties that come with that, because it's a threat on your employment, that then creates a cloud around clear ethical decision making, because it's a hard thing to do, to put your own job on the line.
Well, we do hear from our membership that they find their job very demanding and stressful at times, and I think I sound like a broken record because I've been saying that every year, but it does seem to increasingly be getting worse due, I think, to the lack of resources, investment, and just the post-COVID world we live in. But as a result of that, well-being has never been more important. And I was reading in the Law Society Gazette that the Mindful Business Charter, that's an organisation focused on creating a mentally healthier workplace, has written an open letter to the legal profession, which followed the death of a solicitor, following what they say is a tsunami of change hitting the legal profession, not least through the impact of AI, which runs the very real risk of making the situation worse. And they added that change is likely to mean more pressure and demands on individuals. Um, the open letter said that the legal profession suffers some of the highest levels of mental distress in society. It added many have personality traits such as a predisposition to overworking and subjugating their own needs in favour of those or others, which are risk factors in an industry which play to those very personal characteristics. And we have ended up by default rather than design with reward structures which incentivize and champion them. And in this call to action, the letter said organisations and leaders need to actively monitor the risk, and when identified, actively step in to manage the risk and reduce stress. And our sector, as we've said, is unfortunately no stranger to this. And Deborah, why should lawyers prioritise their well-being, and what can they do, and what can the sector do to support them?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, it goes without saying that the importance of well-being cannot be overstated, and that maintaining mental and physical health is crucial for managing stress, making sound judgments, and actually you want to be a long-term success. You don't want to be burnt out mid-30s. And law is a very demanding profession, and working in a local government environment is also increasingly demanding. So how do you cope with all of this? Now, obviously, if your well-being is good, it's going to make you more productive. You're going to be having better relationships then with your internal clients and your colleagues within your team. And having your own well-being under control leads to greater job satisfaction and fulfillment. So there's an obvious plus to getting to that position. However, the reality is that practically sometimes that can be really, really difficult. Pressures of work, a lack of adequate resource in the legal services team, meaning that you're carrying more and more work, a lack of funding, meaning that posts are either taken out of the structure, meaning you're carrying more and more work. And that pressure to make very quick decisions can actually really sort of chew away at the insides of a lawyer, because you want to make the right decision rather than a quick decision. So you want to be able to research it properly. You want to check that you're giving the correct advice. Now, there's a lot tied in between ethics and well-being. Again, because if you're asked a basic question about can I or can't I do this from a legal perspective, typically that's a fairly straightforward question for a lawyer to answer. But the thing with working in the middle of a local authority is that you've also got to think much wider than that. You've got to do that risk management. You've got to start thinking, okay, well, what will the local stakeholders react? You know, how will the community behave in the context of this decision? You've got to think about whether it impacts any vulnerable people. You've got to think about not just the short-term impact of the decision, but the medium to long-term impact of the decision. And it's quite complex, the process of legal decision-making within a local authority. So what can you do to really give yourself some support here? Well, this, to be honest, is where LLG can help you, because we provide those peer-to-peer networks that can give you some support in your decision making. There's a very old saying that a problem shared is a problem halved. But using that network, so it might be the national lead group, so it might be, for example, the procurement group, because we're going through a new procurement act, etc. It's going to be a time of great change. You're going to be making some decisions for the first time. So using other experts in your network is going to be a key part to supporting your own well-being. It may be that, you know, if you're at the very top of the tree, if you're the monitoring officer and you're facing some really big decisions in your local authority, then some peer-to-peer support from other monitoring officers. The whole phone a friend thing works really, really well. You can test your ideas with other people and they will feed back to you as to where they see some of the pitfalls, and they will share their experience. quite often you're doing these things for the first time, so talk to someone who's perhaps done it before. So you've got your regional networks, your national lead networks, you've got your phone a friend, but then well-being is also about time and space to think. So actually coming along to an LLG conference, for example, and listening to what other people say, and then having that time to reflect on it, can be really useful in helping you to sort out some of your thornier issues. And it's that investment in yourself as well. So LLG really believes in community, and we know this is a tough job, and we know that there'll be people, you know, listening to this podcast who are thinking, I've got this big issue, I just don't know where to start. Well, we can provide you with those mechanisms. We've also got the forum, so you can literally ask the audience to go back to the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire support mechanisms, and see what other people think about the situation that you're faced with and what they can do to help. But it's about looking after yourself. It's about taking time for yourself and making sure that you're the best that you can be. So I would encourage everybody out there to take their own personal well-being very seriously.
Some really great advice there, Deborah, and I would urge any listeners who are struggling at this time to contact an organisation called Law Care, who have a telephone advice line that you can phone and just have someone listen to you. Don't suffer alone at all. Well, Deborah, thank you ever so much for talking to me today. Any last comments before we wrap up for the day?
Well, I think what I would really love is for every lawyer who listens to this to then go back to their desk and to just pause for a moment and think about any of the ethical consequences of any of the advice that they've given, or any contracts that they've looked at, or any decisions that they've made today, and just sort of do a bit of hindsight and think, is there anything else we should have thought about? But then also to sit down and think, what about me? How can I improve my well-being at the end of this day? And to go away and to do something just for you, whether that's a walk in the park, or phoning a friend just for a chat, or some yoga, whatever it may be, but factor in something for your own well-being, and then your week will be better from the off.
And on those wise words, you can read all about developments in local government law and practice by going to bulletin number 14, available on the LLG website now. And don't forget, you can now also follow us on Spotify by searching for the LLG Grapevine. Thanks for joining me today, Deborah.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and goodbye.